And this week's episode of It's Your Time You're Wasting, we ask, should teachers be vaccinated?
Should students wear masks?
And is the curriculum absurd?
And is the DFE too centralised? All these questions and more will be at least mulled over, if not answered, in tonight's episode. See you then.
You can cry and cry until your eyes are red. You can toss and tumble on a sleepless bed, but you're wasting your time trying.
Hello, welcome to It's Your Time You're Wasting. And
It does feel like my time this week, I have to say, Martin.
what have you been wasting your time doing this week, David?
Well, most of my week's been spent working out how to deal with the absolute mess that the government has left for schools to sort out, how to award grades for this year's Year 11 students. So that's been a lot of fun trying to deal with that. But today, I got my first vaccination. I think we've even got, for them as needs evidence, there's even a picture of my vaccine passport or whatever it is. There you go, proof positive that I am now pure.
That's almost like a vaccine passport, isn't it? I mean, you can present that in Marks and Spencer's when you don't wear your mask and say, but look.
Yeah, worth cash.
And go to, I think, Cyprus. You can have a holiday in Cyprus soon.
All of that, yeah. So I'm looking forward to those things happening.
And I noticed it was AstraZeneca.
You're terribly old. Have you had your vaccine?
Well, I'm terribly old, yes. And of course I haven't. So it must mean that you're on the list for some reason, because you're under the age of 50, are you not?
I am.
You must be on the list for slightly other reasons. So what is it?
Congenital syphilis, I think we agreed.
Yeah, we said it's probably congenital syphilis. Yeah, that
probably is. The data your doctor keeps on you. You have one ill-advised conversation, and oh my goodness, your notes are rancid forever.
Yeah, but perhaps they've mistaken you for someone else. Perhaps you're.
Yeah, I went in and they said name, and I said David Didau, and they went, "Oh, that David Didau or the other."
Well, perhaps they thought you're some elderly pensioner or something.
Yes, and that's obviously borne out by my appearance, isn't it?
Now, you're very lucky, I mean, to have that. And I noticed there's a second jab coming up in May, I think it is, for you. My mum had a second jab this week.
Great.
And she's in her 90s, so she's doing all right now.
Yeah.
And it's good to see, really. But should President Biden?
Oh, yes.
Now, he's tweeted out there about teachers being vaccinated. Should teachers be vaccinated as a priority?
Well, they will be in America.
How about over here? I mean, you're a teacher. You've been vaccinated, but
I've been vaccinated not because of my status. No. So obviously, I can now waive that vaccination card. I work across a number of schools, so that I don't know whether that will be reassuring, because I think the part of the thinking is that as having been vaccinated, it doesn't mean that you can't pass on the virus. So there's still the case that you might be a spreader.
I think there's the jury's out on this. There's more and more evidence coming through that perhaps it's not spread by people who haven't got it, if you like, or haven't got so much in their nasal passages. I don't know. Let's not worry too much about the science about this, because we haven't got the details.
No.
We clearly need an expert.
Lose ourselves very quickly, won't we, Martin?
We clearly need an expert to help us out. But there's been a lot of argument about whether teachers should have, or indeed frontline workers of various sorts, whether it be police, security guards, taxi drivers, etc., etc.
Workers, that sort of thing. Yeah. Obviously, we've prioritised NHS workers and social workers,
care workers,
but not teachers. And so, well, how does the argument go? Well, I think people would make the argument that vaccinating teachers maybe wouldn't make that much difference if children continue to be vectors. infection. But on the other hand, it would keep teachers safe. And I think there are still teachers after the 8th of May who will continue to be shielding, who for underlying health reasons perhaps are concerned about exposing themselves. Although they probably should have been done. What is the government justification, Martin? Why aren't they?
Well, I think the justification they gave, for a start, they have mentioned it a couple of times explicitly in the press conferences, and that is that teachers do not seem to catch COVID or die from COVID any more than any other particular realm of the workplace. So I don't know whether that's true. People have argued about when the figures were taken from, and I think it being September was the last thing. So it hasn't taken into account the new Kent variant or all these other things. But I think the strongest thing that was said by JVT, as he should be known, and that is that if you start bringing in occupations, you start to interrupt the winding out of the vaccination itself. So if you start looking for teachers, so shop workers, etc., 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 you might slow down the whole thing. And you are a case in point of this. It seems to be going quite quickly. So by the time everyone gets through, it might be much quicker. But if you started putting occupations in, it might slow it down quite a lot.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, the testing centre, the vaccination centre that I attended this afternoon was an incredible production line. We were whisked obviously it was the AstraZeneca vaccine, which means you don't hang about afterwards. You just, you're done and out. And literally, I was in the building. I spent far more time queuing than I did being vaccinated. I think if you have the Pfizer vaccine, you have to hang around for 15 minutes or so. But it was an incredible production line, and I think there must have been in the periods where I was going through, there were a couple of hundred people on the conveyor belt, and I know, and so over the course of the day, how many people are going to be done in that time? Potentially, or certainly hundreds, potentially thousands in a single test centre in a single day, and the rate at which we are rolling it out. I think the aim is, and the figures are on target for the adult population to be done by entirely by the beginning of June.
Yeah, and there's certainly some evidence that it's working as well. That the case rates are going down in the over 80s now, and then it's sort of working its way through the system. So Brazil variant notwithstanding, it looks pretty good news. And also with the community transmission is going down, and this is where schools come in to it, of course, is that they think whether schools will drive a rise in community transmission, we await to see, and whether that is in certain areas or other areas. But certainly it looks, touch wood, I'm touching some wood here, it looks good news overall, that this might be a way out of all this misery for all of us, and hopefully we won't need to close schools again.
Well, let's hope not. But one of the mechanisms for trying to ensure that schools stay open is masks for students during lessons. And there are a multiplicity of views on this. I think we've got a couple of I don't know what they're representative of, but a couple of different camps here being represented by views. Apologies for the slightly fruity language here. These were Martin's pick.
I love the primary school teacher sort of using the mask to mumble beneath the mask, for fuck's sake, instead of just thinking it when they're handed in.
Yeah, no, that would normally be the case. So, and at least one head teacher has said that he will not be enforcing any government guidelines about making children wear masks in schools.
Yeah, I mean, David Perks of East London Science School, interestingly enough, it's a science school, so they must know what they're talking about, mustn't they? Is saying that he won't force children in his care to wear masks in lessons. And obviously the government as well stated that secondary school kids should wear masks in lessons, and then it seemed to wobble a bit and then say this isn't actually statutory guidance.
I know we were talking about like this last week that there's an idea that schools actually are going to be prevented from compelling students to wear masks. So, and we had that conversation about, you know, where does the line stop with uniform? What are schools allowed and not allowed to specify? And
do you think they should wear masks? I mean, you're going back to the front line, perhaps, or certainly you're working with people who will be. Do you want kids in secondary schools to wear masks in lessons, at least up till Easter?
So I think probably if it were down to me and in the round, I would say no, not in classrooms unless they want to.
And is that because that there's miraculously the bug will not move around in a classroom? I mean, what?
Well, no. So of course, you know, there is the chance of infection. Of course, there is. But I think that you know, that if we follow other guidelines about keeping windows open and about having more movement in and out of classrooms so that children aren't sitting in the same place for too long, that should be minimised anyway. You know, I can see that we'd minimise it further by wearing masks, but then you have to think, well, what are the other costs? And as David Perks makes clear in his interview that he's done, is that we're finally getting students back into school after this period of remote teaching, where we've not been able to see their face and they've not been able to participate in business as usual, and that maybe the fact that we're trying to normalize school, we're trying to get them in and we're trying to get them to speak and to take part in conversations and debates, maybe that weighs in favor of fewer masks. But you know,
yeah, it's
about it.
I think facial expressions and all that are so important, you know. I mean, perhaps because I've got an expressive face, but certainly for kids who've just been staring at a screen all this time and not really interacting. I mean, this is certainly one of the reasons why in primary it's not being thought about, as well as perhaps infections don't tend to happen so much in primary, they reckon.
Yeah.
But also we've got to think about social apartheid, haven't we, in classrooms? Have we got a thing from the Daily Telegraph? Oh, Claire Fox talking about it here. Okay.
The Daily Telegraph, too strong even for Claire, who said apartheid, obviously not quite the right word to be used here. But you know, explain what the Telegraph are on about here, Martin.
Yeah, so they're talking about kids who are refusing to wear masks in class being moved to the back of the classroom and having to sit in the back row. Now, of course, you need a system of rows in order to allow that to happen, because if you've got groups, would they sit in a group together? I do not know.
Well, one of the big changes over the course of the year, Martin, is that classrooms were seated in rows, whether teachers liked it or not. And it was that was quite an interesting little social experiment in terms of classroom dynamics, because I think a number of teachers who hadn't had their classrooms organised in that way had surprised themselves with how it changed the dynamic, often for the better, sometimes maybe not. So rows should be, I think, continue to be the norm at the moment.
But if now, this is the thing. This is why it's such a strange idea that they should be sat at the back. I mean, traditionally, when I was at school, all us naughty ones would sit at the back anyway. But so the naughty ones without masks, at the back of the room. Now, it depends where your windows are as well, doesn't it? Because if there are windows behind there, then you're blowing all the hot air from these children down to the front of the class. I mean, it sounds to me slightly a ridiculous rule if you're trying to stop. I don't know why even put them in the same classroom. I mean, you know, if there's thought to be such a bad thing about not wearing masks, then why have them in the classroom anyway? So where does this apartheid get drawn? Why is it in the classroom and not sit them out in the corridor and breathing on each other or something?
Isn't that more of a social apartheid?
Yes, completely. Put them into their own classrooms. Yeah, I mean, no. If
you round them into little rooms where they can talk on each other.
they can breathe over each other and just sort of, happily breathing and using facial expressions and all those other things. I think I tend to agree with you, though, that masks, I'd prefer it if kids weren't having to wear masks in classroom. I think it's just one of those things that makes people think they're doing something extra.
I think so. I think it's interesting. I think there was a very similar policy in the Second World War, making sure everybody had gas masks. Nobody ever needed them, but it reassured people. And I think that the policy decision was made to be as much about psychological comfort as it was physical safety. And I think maybe that's the big reason behind the mask wearing.
Now, I don't know if this is apocryphal or right or not, but also in the Second World War, people gave up their garden railings for the war effort, and they were meant to be melted down and turned into aeroplanes or something like that. Now, I don't know if this is true, like I said. So you go around London and bits of railings are missing where they perhaps should be. And apparently never used for, it was just for morale, apparently. So perhaps masks are for morale.
Yeah, maybe there's a fascinating rabbit hole we could disappear down here. Apparently,
it took me to the Second World War.
I know. Well, apparently the government actually closed off tube stations and didn't allow any people to hide from air raids in tube stations. And the fact that everyone was down there singing is a complete myth.
Something else we could do, we could actually have kids who refuse to wear masks. They could all take the steam train to Dorset and live with farming families.
We could bomb them.
Or you could just bomb them and cut out the middleman. That'll sort it out.
And then we could do slum clearance.
Yes, that's it. And we can, and indeed, because we're going into complete metaphor land here about this.
Very, very silly, but there are people saying, that this is our blitz. This is our
blitz
experience of world.
We've definitely gone down a rabbit hole.
I know. Is it our blitz? Is it our World War II? I don't know.
So should kids wear masks in class? Probably not, in our opinion, but it's be down to the teacher in that classroom to decide as well, because some teachers will feel safer with it.
Yeah, I think that's a tough one. If you leave it to individual teachers to decide, I think that children are going from classroom to classroom and having to change expectations. I think that makes it quite difficult for those teachers that do feel very nervous. So, maybe I'm convincing myself here that it's better to mask them up. I don't know, but it's a tough one.
Yeah. Well, we'll see how that goes.
It's as short-lived as possible.
So when they get back into classroom, what are they going to be teaching? That's the next question, isn't it, really?
Wow. And yeah, so we've got it. There we are, curriculum absurdities. So this our little mini TV headline there comes from an article that was in Prospect magazine this week, where the I've forgotten her name, Eliane
Glazer.
Yeah, who was saying that home learning has exposed all of the things that she thinks are a little bit daft, and she sort of is a self-confessed advocate of the knowledge-based curriculum. She's broadly supportive of Michael Gove's reforms. But in that article, she says that the knowledge-based curriculum has failed on its own terms, Martin.
Yeah, I think it is quite a good article, actually. And what's happened, of course, is the knowledge-based curriculum as an idea has met schooling as an instrumentalist device for getting kids through certain exams in certain ways at certain times. And those two things together don't necessarily make for a good mix.
Right.
Did I stop too soon there for you?
Yeah, you did a little bit. You did. Yeah, so she talks about the facts that there are loads of things that her children just don't know that she thinks they ought to know, and the things that they are doing in schools seem to be arcane and abstruse and not in any way related to anything that the person on the street might consider to be worth learning. And
well, this is part of it, isn't it? That of course, because homeschooling has taken, if you took a great interest in what your kid was doing with homeschooling, you would have found some very odd things going on, like WALT she mentions, you know.
Yeah.
So these acronyms that were only known to school teachers are now sort of leaking out into common parlance, perhaps in certain areas of Islington and other parts of the country. But
yeah, I think that, I mean, there's a kind of almost a various layers of archaeological accretion here that are backing up, so that we're bundling the complaints under the heading of knowledge-based curriculum, as if WALT and WILF and these sorts of things are in any way part of that. But they've been around, especially in primary schools, for a good long time. They certainly predate Gove's reforms. And
it's where the two have met that have, you know, it's definitely that sort of crash, if you like.
So more grammar, more, you know, more fronted adverbials and all of that sort of stuff. But let's carry on. Let's keep faintly ridiculous sounding learning objectives and
WALT and WILF,
making sure children copy those down into their books. Let's do all of it. And yes, and maybe the result is a bit of an unpleasant stitching together of things which could very properly have been left separate.
She quotes a teacher from Bristol who talks about year 6 and says year 6 are essentially cheating, getting children to copy pretty much what the teachers write throughout the year for evidence in writing. And actually every school is doing it that I've ever worked in, because everyone is so scared of the bad inspection that will follow a bad SATs result, the fear that you could go into special measures or be forcibly academicized.
Yeah, well, this is the problem writ large. Obviously no SATs again this year, but it's the problem being faced in secondaries with having to award grades. And we had the previous head of research at Ofsted, Daniel Mouse, was tweeting in the week about a summary of 40 years of research into teacher assessment, and the finding there broadly being that teachers are not very good at doing this, not because teachers aren't very good about doing it, but because human beings aren't very good at it, and teachers turn out to be human beings. There we are. So that's behind a paywall. If you want to have a look at it, you're going to have to either belong to some sort of research institution or pay, I think, $40 or something like that.
Interesting there. I mean, saying that teachers systematically overestimate the achievement of pupils.
Yeah.
And if everyone does that, is it a problem?
Well, you know, have a look at some of the countries where they don't have standardized testing. So, for instance, you've got countries like Sweden, where all of students' attainment in school is assessed via teacher assessment, teacher judgments on how well they've met curricular aims. And so according to that measure, attainment in Sweden has gone through the roof since that's been introduced. It's an incredible success story. The picture on the ground, I think the picture for people living in Sweden is that it doesn't seem to bear out the reality of what students seem to know and be able to do. And that certainly seems to be confirmed by things like PISA, in which the PISA tests Sweden have fallen through the floor over the last 20 years or so. So there's a huge disparity, and maybe it would seem reasonable, certainly if we're citing that piece of evidence from Daniel, that teacher assessment is very much part of the problem.
Yeah, I like the way you're going through roofs and floors and
You like that?
and all these things. You wrote an article yourself for a magazine this week, I think, about GCSEs. What were you saying in that?
Well, I was just sort of pointing out the fact, you know, lots of people sort of discussing whether or not we should get rid of GCSEs or reform them in some way. Rather less talk about whether grades are the right thing to do. And I was just playing with the idea that in many other spheres, grades are considered to be distractingly toxic. So one of the big changes in school inspection over the past few years is that we no longer judge individual teachers' lessons or teachers themselves, because it was considered to be problematic in all sorts of different ways. And if we're sort of acknowledging and agreeing that grading one group of people is probably not a good idea, but grading another group is, maybe that's mistaken. So I was just sort of having a look at are there any potentially viable alternatives to to grades, and the big complaint, the big piece of resistance always seems to be that the people who really need grades are students' next destination. So sixth form providers, they need to know who to accept onto their courses. Universities need to know who to award places to, and employers need to know. And that sort of then makes us think, hang on a second, if what we're doing in school is purely so students can go somewhere else, doesn't that mean that our entire raison d'etre as school teachers is that that everything we're doing is aligned to sorting children, classifying them, and making sure that some can go to some places and others can't? And if that is what we're doing, how comfortable do we feel about that?
Yeah. And of course, we have all these problems with various different ideas for trying to sort out the curriculum in schools, some of which are more absurd than others, or seem to be more absurd than others. There've been a few discussions this week over on social media talking about dialogic and non-dialogic teaching, talking about philosophy for children, and even talking about white maths. We have where should we start?
Well, maybe before we get into that, I should say, the idea of whether or not we should keep grades was something I was very much interested by after reading. I can never remember how to say Jared Korvaf and David Bott's book, 10. Oh dear me, I'm so poor at remembering these things. 10 things I hate about you, or something like that.
Oh, thank you.
And it's a popular teen drama from the 90s, I believe.
10 things schools get wrong, I think you find.
That's right. And we also noticed this tweet. Oh, can we put that back? We haven't quite had a chance to have a look at it.
Burp rather than. There we go.
That was Samantha. Their fingers slipped, I think, as it so often does for her. So here we've got Paul Cochrane talking about a tweet here that comes from a Welsh teaching group, something Impact, and they're pointing out the slightly surprising origin for 21st century skills. Now, regular viewers might remember that we had David and Jared on the show a few months ago, before Christmas anyway, and that's still available if you look through our, I don't know, what do you call it, repository of previous shows. You'll find the interview with David and Jared, but you were particularly taken by this story, weren't you, Martin? I
loved the bit about where the 4 C's came from. The 4 C's famously for 21st century skills, and I'm sure we can remember them because they all alliterate. That's creativity, collaboration, critical thinking, and
communication. There we are. And I'll just read you a tiny snippet from the book, and it was the bit in the photograph there. It turns out, they tell us, that the C21 skills were established at a breakfast meeting held at Adams Mark Hotel in Dallas, Texas, on the 15th of November 2002. This breakfast was sponsored by the National Education Association, was endorsed by the US Department of Education, and involved 6 parties. So the 6 people that came up with this were from AOL Time Warner, Apple, Cisco, Dell, Microsoft, and SAP. I don't know who SAP are, but I'm sure they're a technology company.
They're probably some evil conglomerate, international conglomerate or something.
Probably. Following this meeting, these companies released a document outlining the aforementioned 4 21st century learning skills, the very first sentence of which reads, "Successful businesses are looking for employees who can adapt to changing needs, juggle multiple responsibilities, and routinely make decisions on their own. There is an evolving demand for 21st century skills in our economy." And so it's kind of nice to think that a part of the agenda that's driving some schools or some education systems is to meet the needs of these huge multinational corporations, isn't it, Martin?
Yeah, and I like the way that Paul turned the maybe sober breakfast into a boozy lunch in his thing, because
it's a metaphorically boozy lunch, isn't it?
It does seem quite potentially like a boozy lunch sort of thing to come up with. We've had all this time. What should we come up with? 4 words beginning with C, none of which we can actually sort of really work out exactly what that means in practice, and then leave that to schools to try and sort out. And so much of the problem for the last 10 years to 20 years even in education has been trying to sort out how to work on the agenda of these international conglomerates and what they want from education. What do you mean more creativity, more communication, more critical thinking, and we've been trying to work out how to get that into lessons. And of course, this is the opposite of the knowledge rich curriculum. But again, we're not even sure what that is either, of course.
And we had yet again the one of the boss at the OECD, Andreas Schleicher, reminding everybody that we don't need to know anything today because Google knows everything.
Yeah, well, of course, it is strange, isn't it? Google, of course, knows nothing. Google can't know anything, and unless, of course, it's the company Google. And then, do you really want Google to know everything that you're looking for on your search engine, David?
I do, because I'm holier than thou, Martin.
But if they're in control of information, I mean, it's extraordinary that the people who argue for these things are quite happy to give up control of information, of knowledge, to unanswerable, faceless, I will call them faceless, conglomerates. I find it, and American at that as well,
Well, there is, I mean, there's that aspect of it, but I think the thing that I think people find irksome about Andreas Schleicher is that everything he says seems to directly contradict the findings of his own organization over the last 15 years or so. And I think what is very, very clear from looking at OECD findings is that knowing things is pretty useful. And it's really difficult to be creative whilst not really being aware of anything. It's very difficult to think critically about something you don't know anything about.
I quite like the idea of ignorance being the thing that the education system should foster, In other words, lack of knowledge. Knowing things isn't worthwhile. Google knows it all. So what are you going to do with your empty brain time?
I know. And it's interesting. I mean, some people say nobody ever says this. Well, Andreas Schleicher does. Anyway, him aside, tell us, what do you mean by white maths, Martin?
Well, there was an article about this. Can we put it up? There's no such thing as white math. Now, obviously, there's been some argument about this, and it's whether people are just changing the language around an old argument, which I kind of think this to some extent is, that there's an argument in maths between those who teach in a traditional way and those who want to teach in a more progressive way, let's say, and now they're using race as part of that argument. Now, the argument in the article that I've just put up there is arguing for such things as 2 + 2 = 4, and maligning people who think that 2 + 2 = 5, things like that, which I'm sorry, but I don't quite get. Do you get what this is all about?
Well, I think it's partly to do with the valuing of the process over the product, Martin, and that there are some maths educators who say that we should be rewarding the thinking that students are doing. So if they've understood the concept of addition but actually got the wrong number, that we should be awarding and acknowledging the fact that they have understood that you get a bigger number than 2 and 2 certainly don't make 1. That would be.
But is this to some extent a straw man, a straw person, or whatever? Because people have said, if you get the answer wrong, show us you're working out. For centuries, as far as I'm aware, maths teachers have been saying, put your working out down there, and then we can actually say, oh yeah, you've done the right, or here's where it went wrong, or here's where it went right. What's wrong with? It's
difficult to know that so often with these things, I think we talk past each other. That often people are responding to dog whistles, and which makes us very tribal and a bit irritable with each other. But you're right, Martin. I don't think I'm not aware, and please get in touch to correct us. If you are a maths teacher who is only interested in right answers and is uninterested in seeing children's working, we'd be very interested to hear that point of view. But as far as I'm aware, that doesn't really exist. I think you're right, Martin. So but the idea being presented or at least characterized in this article, is that a focus on getting right answers is evidence of white supremacy, and that treating children as being less good at maths because they get all the answers wrong is racist. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, again, it's bringing the social justice idea into the classroom. The point being, of course, is kids, not necessarily because of the color of their skin, but because of the background. So things like poverty and other things come into the mix as well.
Yeah.
But the big question is whether we want, and I'm going to use this term very advisedly, we've already used it, we want an apartheid approach to education, where some people are educated in some ways and other people are educated in other ways, because in the name of social justice, does it actually deliver social justice in the longer term? And there are other arguments, like I think Greg Ashman, for instance, an Australian, well, he's English, but he lives in Australia, maths teacher, who's arguing that actually, if you're going to deliver social justice, you have to teach people properly, he would say.
Yes, and I've got a lot of sympathy with that argument. Hard not to. It's always going to be the least advantaged students, I think, who are more likely to fall victim to these sorts of slightly eccentric methodologies. That the most privileged of our students are the most able to cope with deficits in their teaching at school and have those needs met elsewhere, or to opt out of the system and go to somewhere a bit posher, some fancy private school instead, to make sure they don't have any of that, or to pay to get more of it if that's what they prefer.
I think this is the argument, of course, of people like Catherine Birbal Singh. And if people want to look at the interview with her that we did some time ago, by the way, subscribe to the channel and you'll pick up any interviews. We've got Doug Lemoff coming up, for example. Do subscribe and you will find immediately on your doorstep, when these things come out,
Probably not
lovely on your doorstep, metaphorical doorstep, you'll find an interview. Your YouTube doorstep or something like that. But these arguments also came up this week in terms of dialogic and non-dialogic teaching.
Yes, there was a report published from the Education Endowment Foundation, the EEF, and they've been conducting a big meta-analysis on philosophy for children. And this is following a few years ago, there was a very controversial small-scale study which indicated that philosophy for children, which is basically, I think, asking children questions, ethically themed questions, like, is it wrong to punch a teddy bear, that sort of thing. No, I believe that is one of the questions, Martin.
I know, but of course it's wrong. Carry on.
It's wrong. Anyway, but is it wrong? And to explore that as an idea and get children talking about it. The claim was made that this actually improves children's reading scores. And as I say, there was quite a bit of fuss and controversy at the time. Lots of people said, hang on a second, what's the plausible mechanism for talking about those sorts of issues, improving reading? How can that actually happen? And so maybe unsurprisingly, this study found that philosophy for children does not, in fact, seem to make any appreciable difference to reading scores. And a part of the response to that has now been people saying, well, why did we think it would anyway? And so I think
I'm with that. I mean, why on earth? There is a more famous example, more usual example perhaps of this, and that is music. People argue that music will improve your math score. Now, even if it does, and I'm not saying one way or the other, I don't think it matters, you see. Even if it does, that doesn't mean to say music should be less or better thought of. Music is a thing in itself and therefore should be celebrated as a subject in itself. Now, the same thing for philosophy for children, perhaps. Is it good enough in itself? And this is where I might have a different argument. Does it teach kids philosophy? I don't think it does.
No, I think that we go back to the point that you made a moment ago about dialogic teaching, whatever that means. Well, we can maybe talk about it in a moment. But it seems to be that proponents of P4C, as it's affectionately known, is that it gets children talking and debating and discussing ideas. That, I think, is the main justification for it. We had an interview with Kate McAllister and James Mannion again a few months ago about their recent book, Fear is the Mind Killer, where they were discussing that this is, in their view, one of the best ways to get children to attain better more broadly. This will help with their metacognition. It will make them better at learning to learn. And whatever you think about that as an argument, it's certainly a very different argument from claiming either that philosophy for children is going to improve reading scores, or indeed philosophy.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of debate, discussion, dialogue, I am all for those things. I think it should be in classrooms, and children should learn how to do these things well, eloquently, beautifully, and all the other things that go with it. And classrooms should be places where a dialogue takes place at some point, if not quite a lot, and it's got to be, of course, subject based, subject relevant to what you're learning about. And I think that's perhaps the connection. I call it the connection between grammar and dialectic, but let's not worry about that here. But the connection between the knowledge you're learning and the discussion you're having about that knowledge needs to be quite important. So for me, philosophy for children tends to fall apart because, yeah, it's nice to discuss whether you should hit I'm going to say polar bear, teddy bear. You should never hit a polar bear, by the way. If you're anywhere near a polar bear, you should get out of the way. But whether you should hit a teddy bear or not, what you should be learning perhaps is about morality and ethics, and seeing what different philosophers have said about those things, and then think about it in scenarios such as, therefore, should you hit a teddy bear? So you're doing more background knowledge about it, if you like. So have the discussion, but where do people's different thought processes go on the stands they take on these things?
More broadly about whether or not dialogic teaching is a good thing, our glorious leader, current Education Secretary Gavin Williamson, goodness knows how much longer he's going to cling on, but there he is, white knuckles and all, tweeted this week that children should be sitting facing the front and having traditional instruction. And Neil Mercer, the professor of concentrating on oracy and dialogic teaching at Cambridge, responded to this saying that's nonsense, that actually all the research is supportive of dialogic classrooms. And then that, again, we're talking about dog whistles and unhelpful conversations launched into lots of people saying, what is dialogic teaching? Is it classrooms in which there is dialogue, where there is debate, where there is discussion, where ideas are challenged, or is it about classrooms where there is group work? And answer comes the very little.
Yeah, I think we could split this into 2 points, perhaps. First of all, should Gavin Williamson have, like the health secretary, taking sort of ideas about how to work in the operating theatre, perhaps is the analogy here. How deeply into what goes on in the classroom should the education secretary get? If the education secretary says one thing, this is the right way to teach, then what's he saying about the professionalism and expertise of teachers? And this is an age-old problem. Of course, he's not the first, nor will he be the last education secretary to get involved in arguments about pedagogy and curriculum content. But that's one thing. Putting that to the side, the other argument about dialogue and what it actually involves is another problem with education. We come up with these terms, and then everyone has a slightly different idea about what that might mean. And you can get into huge arguments, and perhaps you're actually arguing about differences on the head of a pin,
I very often, and there's two sort of competing strands which I find fascinating in these debates. That there's on one camp, there's people who are determined to say that there is absolutely no difference and we're all talking about the same thing, and others who are equally determined to try and make, well, maybe it's the vanity of small differences, that they're determined to make things which are superficially different essential.
Yeah, I mean, we see it everywhere. In fact, I mean, the argument between Nicola Sturgeon and Alex Salmond, this week has been, perhaps so convoluted for those of us on the outside that we can't quite see what they're arguing about. I think the same for dialogic and non-dialogic teaching, really. If you're on the outside here, you're saying, well, you're both saying that there should be discussion in classrooms.
I think that's the point. I think the ultimately there's nobody, again, if you think there should be no discussions in classrooms, if you think children being able to debate ideas is a bad thing, let us know. We'd be fascinated to hear you express that point of view. But as far as I'm aware, nobody does express it. And so the debate, I guess, really is how much dialogue we want in classrooms.
And how you structure it and how you get there. And of course, these things then become about what you're talking about. What's your content? What's your subject area? I think as a drama teacher, we might have a different form of dialogue and perhaps more of it in groups than you would do in the average maths classroom. I do not know if that's true, but I suspect it.
Probably, and I think in a PE classroom with children playing team sports, they'll probably be working together in groups more productively than perhaps in a modern foreign languages classroom. Not for me necessarily.
Je ne sais pas, monsieur.
There we are. It's all Greek to me, Martin.
Quite right.
Oh, wow.
You think it's about group work then, do you?
Pardon me?
You think it's mainly about group work?
I think it's partly about that. I think some people are big fans of group work, and they would like to see children encouraged and given the opportunity to do more of it. And I think there are others who think group work is the very devil and it should be avoided where possible.
And then it's about rows. Should we be in rows or should we be always tabled in groups? And it's those that goes back down to that old conflict about rows and sitting in around tables looking at each other.
Yeah.
Perhaps that's all it is. I don't know.
That's all it is, with a bit of WALT and WILF mix.
But this is it. What should a education secretary be able to say what's going on in each classroom? And this is where we get to perhaps our last look today at Stalinist anarchy or anarchic Stalinism. Do we have a?
Samantha had real trouble.
There it is.
This, didn't she?
There we
Where
go.
did it come from, Martin? This is Sam Friedman, another previous guest.
Yeah, it's this idea that the DFE actually doesn't quite. It's tried to centralize itself so much over time that it's actually unable to operate at any sort of level that's of use. It does things. It either meddles so incredibly deeply with what's going on, such as Gavin Williamson saying about this is how you should be in the classroom, or it seems to be trying at the same time to set up academies and to give them freedoms from curriculum and all these other things that go with it, that it seems to be caught between the idea of centralizing everything and controlling everything and at the same time giving freedoms out to schools, which it then decides is probably not a good thing.
Well, there we are. What do we think about that? I mean, it does sound pretty damning. It's come from an article in the where was the article?
I've got absolutely no idea, but I think Sam spoke, but the article was then reported in the TES.
That's
where
right.
I saw it.
TES. So yeah, have a look at that and see where you fall. But it does sound damning.
Yeah, he's saying about the DFE can't operate very well in times of stress.
Well, that's
like, and comparing it to the NHS, which has in some instances done rather better than the DFE. The DFE seems to have floundered. But one of the things he did say was that having Gove in charge, he didn't actually put it in these terms, but this is my understanding of it. Having Gove in charge, someone who's a bit proactive and has his finger on the pulse, is slightly better than having someone who has less of a grip on things in charge, which is who is perhaps being found out somewhat more in times of crisis.
Martin, are you making the slightly controversial argument that we oughtn't to have a feckless idiot in charge at the department?
I couldn't possibly use those terms, of course.
Oh. Okay, so you're for feckless idiots, are you?
Well, yeah. I didn't quite say that either. This is putting words into my mouth there.
If you are a feckless idiot in charge of the DF,
you can't get in touch with us.
We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear
everyone who doesn't get in touch with us is clearly a feckless idiot. So don't get in touch with us if you're a feckless idiot.
No, only if you're also in charge.
Write to us and tell.
That's who we want to talk to, which probably we've made unlikely. Anyway, I think most people's lived experience of the DfE over the past year or so has been, to put it charitably, underwhelming.
Yeah, and what the other thing they're trying to do now is get schools to get together in mats, of course, and to sort of get together in groups. I mean, this has been the problem, is setting up the system so everyone's doing their own thing, and then trying to say, oh no, we want them not to do their own thing because it's very difficult to manage. We want them to come together and perhaps collaborate, and you might as well put them back into local authorities, for goodness sake, for the way it's going.
Well, you know,
and that has its own problems.
And that has its own problems. But if you want to hear a really interesting discussion on that, then you should look at the interview that we did with David Cartner and Laura McInerney, talking about this very question. And again, that you can find that in the archives. Anyway, Martin, yes. I don't know about you, but I feel that we might have wasted enough of everyone's time this week. What do you reckon?
I think you're probably feeding the after effects of the jab you had earlier, the prick in your shoulder.
You'd like to think so, wouldn't you? Well, on that note, on that
bombshell,
goodbye for another week, and thank you for allowing us to waste, I don't know, an hour of your time. It's been a pleasure. Bye.
Bye.
You can cry and cry until your eyes are red. You can toast and tumble on a sleepless bed, but you're wasting your time trying to lose